Okay, so today we're going to be focusing on adding some basic layout elements to our website. So if you remember from last week, this is where we were, kind of the current state of things. Everything is in kind of one single column just stacked vertically down the page. Today we're going to be use something called Flexbox to make this look a bit more interesting and to give us some more use of space that makes more sense. For instance, like this links guy right here has got its own whole horizontal row, a lot of empty space right here. Kind of just looks a little bit awkward and not super inspiring. So it'll still be pretty simple what we do today, but there are going to be several new concepts. So make sure you're taking the time to really understand as you're following along. If you have to, pause the video, look at some of the homework material while you're doing it. Just make sure you're taking your time because we are introducing several new things here. So one of the things we'll be doing today, just as kind of preparatory work, is getting some images that we want to show in, say, like a gallery style. I'm getting those images from Unsplash. I'm not going to record this part because I've already done it, but here's what I did, just so you can see. I searched for nature on Unsplash, and then I set the filter here to square images. So we just want to make it easier on ourselves since we're making a gallery, not have to crop everything to be a square. If you just go ahead and filter by square, then you'll just get those. So these are just practice images. In reality, you'd probably want to use some of your own work photos for this, but for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to be using Unsplash. And I've already downloaded those images right here in this raw images folder. So you can see I've got 4 images that we're going to be using for our gallery. And we'll go through how to resize those and get them ready for the web as well. But that won't come until later. Let's go ahead and open up our code. I'm going to drag my folder down to my code editor here. And whoop, there it is. And let's make the code a bit bigger. Blow that up a bit. And so let's see. Let's also go ahead and open up our website on the right of our code editor. I'm just going to do this full screen here. So I've got the website open on the right here, code open on the left. It's always a good way to start a new coding session. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move this image up in the same row as the text and button here. So to do that, we need to create a few boxes on our page. And when I say the word box, usually you want to think about a block level element. In particular, there is no box tag, but you could think of the div tag itself as a box. So I'm going to add a div tag, and I'm going to wrap it around everything I want to be in that row. So that goes from the image right here down to the button. So I'm going to close the div down here. Now let's go ahead and indent these over. So I'm going to select it, hit the tab key. Again, that doesn't really do anything functional. It just makes it easier to read. And since we're going to be adding several nested divs, it's going to be kind of essential to have some like formatting in the code here. So the first thing I do is I add that box around everything. If I refresh, no difference really. And then now this div right here is going to act as our row div. And so I'm going to give it a class equals row. And if you remember from last time, a class is just a way to give a tag a name that you later can then use in CSS. So let's go ahead and do that. In our styles.css, I'm going to add the new styles that we're doing today at the top here. You could put them wherever you like in your CSS document. But I'm going to make a new style rule for the class name row. So dot row. So in CSS, a dot means you're styling for a particular class name. And I'm going to say display flex. So as you've read about already, Flex layout is a mode or a layout system that lets you display things in columns or rows, and it can be used to create all kinds of layouts. In particular, it can be very helpful when you're trying to align things, say vertically. In the past, trying to align one element with another element vertically was like very difficult and required all kinds of terrible hacks. But in Flex, it's really easy. So if we do this .row display flex, we'll see what happens when we refresh our code now. So look, everything inside that div, let's look at the div again. This may not be what you expected, but everything inside this div, this row div, is now displayed in a row. So each little, like the image is its own column, the H1, the P, each one of those ends up being in its own column here, which looks kind of weird, right? That's not really the effect we want, so we need to do some more grouping. So let's leave the image as is for now, and let's group off all this text stuff. So the heading, the paragraph tag and the button, we're going to put in their own div. And the reason we're doing that is because we want those to stay vertically stacked like they were before. So let's see what happens if I save that and then refresh. And there we go. That's much closer to what we actually want there. So now this is like a more interesting layout maybe, but I've got the spacing problem with this greeting being right up and next to the header. And if you remember from last week, there are several ways of handling this. But probably the easiest way is just to add some padding to this particular element right here. So to do that, let's make another class. Let's just say class equals bio, because that's kind of like biographical information. You could name it whatever you want though. The class name doesn't really matter. It just should be descriptive. And then so I'm going to add a rule for bio. And let's say padding left. So on that left side, let's do 10 pixels of padding. Let's see what that looks like. Yep. Okay, that's a bit better. Now notice that there's some spacing on top of this if I inspect like we did last week using the Chrome inspector. Actually, you know what? Let me move this down to the bottom. You can see when I inspect that element, let me just select it again. The H1, there is margin orange bars on the top and the bottom of that. So let's say if you wanted that heading to align perfectly with the top of that image, you would need to remove that top margin. So to do that, bio H1, so it's saying the heading 1 inside of bio, that's who we're styling. So margin top 0px. I'm just overriding that default margin, and now it's aligned to the top. All right, so that works pretty well, I think, for this. Let's try and see if we can align these two sections together as well. So we've got heading, select work, heading links, and they've each got a list under them. So we can do that a very similar way to what we just did up top. So the first thing we do is we wrap the whole thing in the row class. So we're making a whole row. So let's go ahead and give it a class equals row. That's the cool thing about classes, we can reuse them. And then we're going to close that off right at the bottom of all the lists. So, and then we're going to indent everything inside of it, just like we did up there. And then, just like we did up top, we need to say what are the columns inside this, like where do we want things to stay together. And so I'm going to wrap the first list in a div. So select work and then the list. I'm going to indent that, wrap that in a div, and then right after that, I'm going to wrap the second section in a div, and we'll indent that. Now, as I'm talking here, I noticed that I keep saying the word section. And in fact, that's because these are kind of like sections of the page. Now, there is a more semantic tag. It functionally is exactly the same as a div, but it's more descriptive, and it says section. So let's go ahead and do that. So section, 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 section. That makes it a little bit easier to read, but it's also more descriptive of what these areas are. So again, no functional difference, behaves just like a div, but it's just more semantically correct. So let's go ahead and refresh and see what we got. So yes, they are in columns. Now notice that this links thing is being pushed way over here. And that's because the content of this one, it has more content, so it's just filling the space basically. So, but that looks a little bit awkward. We need these columns to be more equal. So what we need to do here is figure out a way to constrain maybe say this left column, the select work part. So we can do that the same thing with classes. So class equals, let's say work. And then in our CSS, we can just add a max width to that. So dot work, max width, maybe let's say about 66%. So you can use percentages here too, which is convenient because that will work at any screen scale. And if we refresh, then that looks a bit more reasonable. We could still play with that probably to get a better, kind of more pleasing layout, but for now, I think that'll work just fine. So, I mean, we did some very basic stuff, like the only styles we've added here are this whole kind of section here. And we're just using Flex to show things in a row, and we're reusing this row class. And then we're making some adjustments specifically to certain areas of the page. On the HTML side, we just added like a bunch of divs. So we added the row div here, closed it here. We added a div here to control the column for the bio information. Same thing down here, we added these section tags to each one. But the same principle really, we're using the same kind of flex row principle in both sections. All right, so now let's do something kind of even more interesting. Let's use those images that I showed you earlier to make a grid of things. So if I look in my images folder, I've only got my me.svg, but I did create a folder on my desktop called raw images. These are the ones that I downloaded from Unsplash, and these are the big version, okay? So they're not really sized for the web. But I'm going to go ahead and copy them into my images folder for my project. So copy, paste, there they are. Now if I look at these are pretty big. And we've discussed this before, but you don't want to upload your full-size images to your website in most cases, because then the user has to download them, and rarely are you showing them at the size they actually are. So you want to size them to approximately 2 to 3 times the size that you're going to show them. Now, if you're on a Mac, there's a really easy way to do this. Of course, you could resize the images in Photoshop, but I find this is actually faster. If I just open these in Preview, so just the default app for these, it'll open them all up in this kind of stack view. Now I can select them all on this left side. I could shift click all of them or Command A to select them all. And once they're all selected, I can go to Tools, Adjust Size, and it'll adjust them all at once. So let's do 800 pixels wide. And boom, it just resized them all. Okay, so those are all now sized at a more appropriate size for the web. And now we can go ahead and add them to our page. So let's make a new area down here, right below this div before the closing main tag. And let's make it div class equals gallery. So we're gonna make this our image gallery, and then we're gonna add our images in there. So image source equals images, that's the folder name, and then the image name. And then I'm going to do an alt tag, cool image of nature. Of course, you'd want to be more descriptive of your actual thing here, but I'm just doing these as kind of placeholders. And then I'm duplicating that 4 times. Command-Shift-D will just duplicate the line that you're on if you're in VS Code. And 2, 3, 4. And then those should all show up here. And they're pretty big. I mean, they're 800 pixels wide. And they're definitely not in a grid. So there are different ways of making grids for images, but there's like a trick I'm going to show you that's not necessarily covered in your homework. It's a newer, more modern way of doing a grid, and it's much easier even than Flexbox for like a image grid type of scenario. So I'm going to show you another way to do it right here. So .gallery, we're going to do display, and this time instead of display flex, we're going to do display grid. And then you can tell it how you want to lay out your columns next. So first of all, let's do grid template columns and 1 FR. I'll explain this in a second. And then grid template rows, 1 FR, 1 FR. So what does that mean exactly? Let's go through it. So what I want to do is create a 4x4 grid of images. And so I'm telling it on the column side, make 2 slots. So I've got 2 values here. I could do as many of these as I want. If I wanted to do 4 slots, I could do 2 FR, 3 FR, whatever. Or it could all just be 1 FR. You can configure, or 20 pixels. You can configure that grid to have as many like spaces in it as you want. What does FR mean though? I can't remember exactly what the term is. I could look it up. Let's see, CSS grid FR. An introduction to the FR unit. Okay, so he's going through a lot of stuff. What does it actually mean? And he's not explaining it. I believe it just means free space. It basically will just fill up whatever space is available for the grid. And we'll have more resources on this later, so don't worry about the exact meaning. But basically what I'm doing here is I'm saying for columns, so the horizontal axis of my grid, I want 2 slots that will just take up all the free space they can. And then on the row side, so the vertical axis of the column, I want to do the same thing. 2 columns, it'll take up as many free space as I can. So let's see what this gets us. And not much, right? I mean, it did actually put them in the 4x4 grid, but it's bleeding off the screen. So the problem there is that our images are staying at 800 pixels by 800 pixels. So we need to make another style for images. So let's do that. So .gallery and then image. So that's any image tag inside of our gallery. We're going to do max width 100%. So that's the maximum width they're allowed to be. And there we go. Now they fit. So images by default will kind of try to take up as much space as the width of the image. So if you say max width 100%, then they'll be no wider than the container they're in. Which this is the question, what container are they in? Well, they're technically in this gallery div tag, but the real template that they're in is in one of these columns. So it'll only take the max width available. And the cool thing about that is that it's automatically responsive. And I think we've used that word responsive before, but responsive means that the layout you're doing can work at any screen size, or at least all the main screen sizes. So see how that shrinks nicely? This would have been very difficult to do without CSS Grid. So CSS Grid can make these kind of layouts very cool and flexible and responsive. So we'll do a bit more with that, but one of the things I notice immediately is that we need some spacing in here, like to space these images apart. And there happens to be two attributes for that as well. So one is column gap, so the gap between columns. Let's just say 20 pixels. And one is row gap, the gap between rows, say 20 pixels. And now we should get a nice spacing in there, and that'll stay fixed too at different screen sizes. So that's looking a bit better. And I guess finally though, we need to make this work well on mobile. So this is something we haven't really done before. And there's some handy tools for doing it. So if I hit Command Shift J or Command Option J, sorry, or you just open your developer tools, that'll open those up. And I'm going to move this back to docking on the right side. How do I do that? Dock to left, dock to right. Okay. And then the Chrome has a responsive mode. See that little button that looks like a mobile device? So that's what that is for. And it's for explicitly doing responsive design. Now, one thing you'll notice is that as I'm shrinking my screen size here, everything is shrinking, which is usually not what you want. So if I pulled this up on an iPhone, so let's just select an iPhone, you'll see that my page text is really small because it's trying to just zoom out on the website. Basically, it's just zooming it. And that's the default behavior websites will have unless you tell them to not do that, to actually don't zoom at all. This website will scale to whatever screen size you need. And so there's a special meta tag that we have to use for that. So let me go ahead and add that. So let's go to our HTML, and meta tags go up in this head area. So there's our head area. And we're going to add this meta tag. I'm just going to paste it in. So we'll go through this. Meta, name equals viewport. So this says, like, it's basically a tag that's configuring how the screen width and height are handled. And then it's setting the width to the device width in the initial scale to 1. So it basically is just saying in short, it's saying don't try to zoom out on this screen. And so let's look at what the difference is. So I've got the iPhone view selected. I'm going to refresh with that meta tag. Now everything is sized exactly as it was before. It's just on a smaller screen size. So that was more what we're looking for. We obviously need to make some adjustments though. Let's take a look in responsive mode. You can see how just at a certain size, it gets like kind of weird. Like these images are too small. This like length thing is getting like kind of like crammed right up against the edge. And so columns don't really work quite as well at mobile sizes. So usually you need to make some adjustments for a particular screen size. And there is a cool way to do that. And it's called media queries. So let me just show you how that works. Let's expand this out a bit bigger here. Oh, there we go. And in our CSS, we can use a special thing, this special syntax that starts with an @ so @ media, and then there's a parentheses and a condition, max width. Yeah, let's start with like 500 pixels. And let me explain what this does. So a media query basically says whenever these conditions in the parentheses are met, whenever the screen is less than 500 pixels in this case, so the maximum amount of width at which this will apply is 500 pixels, then the CSS inside of this media block will be applied to the page. If this condition is not met, then the CSS will just be ignored completely. So basically you can think of it as making a specific style sheet, like a specific CSS file for just one screen size. And it happens to be within this document. So that's what lets us adjust layout for different screen sizes. And one of the things we want to do is, like, let's say once the screen gets down to, I don't know, maybe 500 pixels or less, then we want to show all of these images inline, just stacked vertically rather than in columns. So let's go ahead and do that. And what we can do here is just override our normal, like we've got our gallery rules up here that are setting up this grid. Those will still apply, but we can override things on them. So I'm going to copy out the template columns and the template rows, paste it in here, and we're going to adjust those. Instead of the 2 columns, 1, instead of 2 rows, only 1. Well, actually, I think we can just leave off the rows. All we need to do is just say one column. And then if we refresh, whoop, so that did not work. Oh, I'm still above my 500 pixels. So if we drag down, watch this. If I get down below 500 now, then see, boom, boom, boom. It's right at where that breakpoint was. So you can think of these rules as like breakpoints that apply different style rules. And, just to make it more obvious, like I could do border 20px, or yeah, I just add a border on it, 20px solid green. Not that I would ever want to do this, but you can see it very visibly change when I get down to that size. So it's just applying the new CSS whenever that condition is true. And you can put as many rules in here as you want. Let's say, like, for instance, I also wanted to say collapse the select work and link section. So let's look at the CSS we did for that. That was on .row and bio and work. Oh yeah, work is max width 66. So I think what we could do here is we could say, well, let's collapse our rows. We could say flex direction column, which instead of going in a row will now go vertically. I got rid of that green border too. And so now everything will stack when I get below 500 pixels. So see that? And you can make other adjustments here too. So like sometimes when you're on mobile, you want to adjust padding and margin to not be so extreme. But there's a lot of little changes you can make. And this, I definitely recommend using this responsive mode because it lets you look at it on multiple device sizes. So like common devices like the Pixel 2, for instance, that's that size. Here's an iPad. And you can get a good sense for, how does this thing respond to multiple screen sizes. So it is very important to do this. It's not like the old days you could design like one version of a website for desktop and maybe one for mobile, and that was good enough. Nowadays, there are so many different devices with different screen sizes, with different screen densities, that you really just have to design for all screen sizes at the same time, which makes your job a bit harder, but there are lots of little tricks like these media queries, for instance, that you can use to do that, exactly that. All right, so that is it for this week. Again, we covered a lot of stuff there. We covered Flex, and we did some basic CSS grid stuff here. And then we also did media queries. So those were kind of like the three main new concepts we introduced today. And just with those three concepts, you could create almost any website layout that you see on the internet. Obviously, there's a lot of detail and there's a lot more to learn about both Flexbox and CSS Grid, but this is a good starting point and a good baseline.